The Jewish revolt didn't end in a blaze of glory, but in a slow, strangling collapse. This is how the death of the revolt began. Jewish-Roman relations were marked by tension, constant, bitter, and often violent. The Jews resisted assimilation, clinging tightly to their religion, while across the empire, from Judea to Alexandria, Jews were being crushed by Roman forces, as the call for revolution grew louder. Most importantly, Rome would use Jewish institutions like the Sanhedrin and the Jewish aristocracy to crush dissent. But who was it that would rise to meet the demand? A people we now call the Zealots. The Zealots weren't just fanatics in name. They defined the term, fusing nationalism, rage, and religious pride into revolution, a people downtrodden by the empire, yet unwilling to kneel. And as Roman authority began to collapse, the Jews would increasingly call for radical, zealot action, and the spark that would reveal this fire came in the spring of 66 AD, when violence exploded in Caesarea and Jerusalem. Thousands were killed, and Jerusalem, Judea's holiest city, fell under the spell of revolutionary propaganda. At the center of this takeover was Eleazar, son of High Priest Hananiah, who led a brutal purge of the old Roman appointed order, even if that meant killing his own father, clearing the path for revolution. But in the chaos, three names would rise, three men whose fates would constantly shape the coming storm: Ananus, Bar Giora, and Ben Simon. Ananus would rise as a moderate Sadducee, a politician who sought stability and tradition above all else. But Bar Giora and Ben Simon would seek power through the will of the people and their fiery will. Zealots at heart. It would be this conflict of interest that would begin to kill the revolution from the inside. We last left off as Ananus, son of Ananus, began centralizing his power as leader of the Jewish revolt. But we overlooked why Ananus came to be who he was. In 63 AD, 3 years prior to the revolt, Ananus would actually rule Judea as high priest. However, he was no ordinary priest, ruling with an iron fist and quashing spiritual dissent. One of the most famous examples of this was his killing of James, the brother of Jesus, illegally using the Sanhedrin to stone political and religious opposition. However, after Roman elites forced him out of power, he would leave the Roman ruling order for the Jewish revolt 3 years later. But once he gained authority, his hunger for control and power would lead him to estrange his very allies, Eleazar ben Simon and Simon bar Giora, and Eleazar ben Hananiah. Arguably, he was just as greedy and power-hungry as the Romans before him were. Ben Simon, still a hero of the Battle of Beth Horon, used his past victories to paint Ananus as a coward and a Roman collaborator. But Simon bar Giora took a very different path. Born into a convert family, he became a national hero after the victory at Beth Horon. But after Ananus told him to step down, Bar Giora would refuse, marching at Masada with his fanatic army to form his own warlord state, waiting for the moment to strike. And on the Roman side, we have the commander Vespasian. Vespasian was a highly experienced Roman general and former politician, having fought at the Roman invasion of Britain alongside Emperor Claudius, and now leading tens of thousands of Romans against the Jews. However, because of Vespasian's political past and massive ambitions as Roman emperor, he was desperate for a painless victory. Thus, his campaign began with the conquest of Galilee, a northern region defended by a man named Josephus, appointed by Ananus to protect the frontier. And with Rome's string of luck finally arriving, town after town would fall to Vespasian's army. But instead of responding with mercy, he would answer Jewish surrenders with carnage. Vespasian would have 12,000 slaughtered at the Roman stadium of Tiberias, while another 36,000 were enslaved to fuel the Roman war machine. Perhaps the most chilling episode was at Jotapata, where every Jewish man was executed after the city fell. The Galilee campaign ended in triumph for the Romans by December of 67 AD. The revolt, however, would not die. But faith in Ananus certainly would, as the Jewish revolt was left utterly humiliated. Having failed to defend Galilee from Rome, Josephus would defect to the enemy Romans, disillusioned with perceived revolutionary incompetence, while his successor, John of Gischala, would flee to Jerusalem by the end of 67 AD. However, no longer would he help Ananus, but backstab him. John was an eyewitness to Ananus' supposed incompetence, even if it was often just to deflect criticism from his own handling of the conflict, and arrived with several thousand Galilean followers, battle-hardened men loyal to his command. Ben Simon would simultaneously move to the streets, rallying public support for stronger leadership. Both men became the face of a rising zealot tide against the moderate regime. This zealot unrest only intensified as Ananus had surrounded himself with the very aristocrats who once upheld the Roman system, where the priestly Pharisees, the Roman-aligned Sanhedrin, or especially the aristocratic Sadducees. To the people of Judea, Ananus was starting to look less like a Jewish patriot and more like the Roman governors who oppressed them for decades. And instead of properly crushing dissent, this time he did nothing, something that would prove to be his downfall. With anger simmering in Jerusalem against Ananus' rule, an army of Idumeans to the south would join the fray on the side of the Zealots. And on a stormy night in late spring 68 AD, all seemed quiet, but behind the thunder, an army moved. The Idumeans waited outside the walls of Jerusalem, eagerly patient to join the Zealot allies. The Zealots were just as eager, desperate to regain control of Jerusalem that they lost to Ananus' elitist regime. Zealot allies would throw open the gates of Jerusalem to the Idumeans, as the Idumeans would massacre much of Jerusalem. Ananus and his government were either slaughtered or fled. The Zealots had taken Jerusalem once more. Ananus' failure was the product of many strategic blunders. He had removed the Zealots Ben Simon bar Giora from power, but in doing so crippled his own army and alienated popular support. He ruled with indecision, too weak to secure popular support to crush the Zealots, yet way too harsh in his persecution to win them over. His reliance on the same elite aristocracy that had once collaborated with the Romans made his rule feel like an extension of Roman tyranny rather than a break from it. While the conquest of Galilee sealed his fate, his downfall was almost inevitable. And like a raging fire, the Jewish revolt would turn to devour itself. Eleazar ben Simon retreated to the massive Jewish temple, leaving John of Gischala as the main ruler of Jerusalem. But being the main ruler doesn't mean being a good ruler, as Josephus writes of John of Gischala turning into yet another one of a string of autocratic rulers. With Ananus dead, John would rule through fear. His fighters looted the streets as the city soaked in blood. Popular support for him dwindled as he, like everyone else, increasingly courted support from elites that would support him, using them as a tool to gain control, just as Ananus and the Romans did before him. As John of Gischala increasingly tore the city apart, and Ben Simon hid behind the walls of the Jewish temple, the Jews were increasingly running out of options to replace the Romans, and that person would be Simon bar Giora. With Ananus defeated and the Zealots tearing each other apart in the year 68 AD, Bar Giora finally had the chance to exit his fortress of Masada and begin his political and military campaign across the region of Judea. According to Josephus, much of the region of Judea was unmanned, probably because the Zealots focused control on the city of Jerusalem rather than Judea itself. And Bar Giora would take advantage of this, marching south and capturing cities like Hebron, while seizing its resources throughout the summer of 68 AD. While many Idumeans and Jews in Jerusalem who were frustrated with the rules of the Zealots fled to Bar Giora's side, Bar Giora would gain a following of nearly 40,000 Idumeans and Jews throughout his campaign, while conquering much of Judea surrounding Jerusalem. And by the spring of 69 AD, Simon bar Giora would finally be in a position to occupy the city. Frustrated with John of Gischala's rule and the constant flight of Jerusalemites from the city, the remaining elites of Jerusalem would invite Bar Giora into Jerusalem. Unbeknownst to the revolutionaries, this would be the final nail to the coffin of the Jewish revolt, as Ben Simon nor John of Gischala would abandon their power so easily. What would ensue was a year-long complete war in the city of Jerusalem, where Bar Giora would be forced to plug his resources into quashing John's attacks into sections like the lower city, which would fall to John's forces that same year. And as the fertile fields of Galilee were lost to the Romans, the resources and supplies any of these Jewish forces had available where Vespasian's strategy of gradually strangling the Jews would eventually reveal itself in its fullest. Even as Vespasian offered peace, the Jews refused, convinced that God would once again deliver them, even when their grain supplies were dwindling and famine was widespread. Archaeology shows coins minted by revolutionary authorities were already preparing the establishment of a new Jewish state, similar to the same messianic expectation that the Jews would be liberated. They weren't just resisting Rome, they believed history itself was on their side and that their religion was supporting them. The very fact that Jewish history up to that point was a set of remarkable victories, whether the return from the Babylonian exile, the Maccabean revolt, or even the Battle of Beth Horon by Ben Simon and Bar Giora, it seemed impossible that their God would abandon them now. According to Martin Goodman from 1987, even the Romans doubted their chances, which explained why they waited years after Galilee's fall to attack Jerusalem. And without Roman pressure, the Jews believed the war was already won and could turn on one another. Vespasian would leave for Rome as his son Titus succeeded his command in 70 AD. The revolution would only realize how utterly wrong they were with the arrival of tens of thousands of Roman soldiers at the heart of Jewish society itself, Jerusalem. When Titus arrived at Jerusalem in 70 AD, the immense scale of the city's walls must have taken him aback, reminding him of how difficult his task ahead was. 3 generals had tried and failed to conquer Judea before him: Gessius Florus, Cestius Gallus, and his own father Vespasian. Titus needed to end this, and quickly, or else his own imperial ambitions to succeed his father will be no more than a joke. As his tens of thousands of soldiers prepared for war, the reality of Rome's might would strike the hearts of the defenders. Despite earlier civil strife, factions within Jerusalem, Simon Bar Giora and John of Gischala, recognized the threat and called a truce. Their forces, once at war with each other, now stood united against the imperial siege, but not before a sudden backstab. After years of constant infighting, John found his victim to betray, but this time it would be at his old acquaintance Eleazar ben Simon. As the soldiers of Rome began to prepare for the siege, John offered a religious sacrifice at the temple alongside Ben Simon. However, as the men marched in, their daggers were revealed, as the entirety of Ben Simon's forces fell to an ambush. Eleazar ben Simon had fought for the Jewish revolt for years, only to be killed by the same revolt he helped start. Despite the intrigue of their leaders, the Jewish defenders did not falter. The historian Tacitus was shocked by their remarkable resistance, saying there were arms for all who could use them. Jerusalem was prepared to fight to the death. And this was revealed at the beginning of the siege, as Titus began reconnaissance outside Jerusalem. That was, until suddenly, a Jewish ambush attacked. Titus nearly lost his life to the assailants, an omen of the fierce resistance to come. After escaping this ambush, Titus would begin his siege from the north, targeting the city's third wall. Attempting to replicate the victory at Beth Horon of 66 AD by Bar Giora and Ben Simon, Jewish forces and their Idumean allies tried to break the siege but failed, suffering heavy losses. The Idumean leader himself, John ben Sosus, who had fought alongside the Zealots for years, was crucified before the city. Despite determined resistance and attempts to destroy Roman siege engines, the outer third wall fell. Jewish fighters used the city's cramped northern terrain to inflict significant Roman casualties, but the Romans adapted, enlarging breaches and demolishing key structures. Now only the second wall and Antonia fortress stood between the Romans and the temple itself, already in range of Roman artillery. Titus paused his assault, hoping the defenders would have a chance to surrender. He sent Josephus, the general who had fought for the Jews at Galilee, to plead for peace. But the Jews repeatedly refused his demands, buoyed by their faith in defeating the Romans. Josephus lamented that they had put more faith in themselves than in God, as if the Jews spiritually failed, a sentiment repeated by Christians to this day. And as the famine that was present before the siege worsened, starvation took its toll. Jewish soldiers began torturing civilians for food. Those who fled were caught between two evils: Roman cruelty outside and zealot tyranny within. Romans slaughtered hundreds of foragers, often for sport. Those who returned from Rome were executed or tortured by John and Bar-Gior's men. Titus responded with gruesome messages, mutilated bodies displayed as warnings of what prolonged resistance would bring. Fighting intensified around the Antonia fortress. John's men dug tunnels beneath siege engines, collapsing Roman towers. Jewish hopes were plummeting until a sudden stroke of luck hit. In a shocking twist of events, 3 Jewish fighters raced into Roman engines as the Romans went from attacking the walls to defending themselves. Countless siege machines suddenly burst into flames as dozens joined. The Romans, stunned by the firestorm, temporarily withdrew. Jewish hope was restored as Bar-Gior and John's destiny of victory seemed inevitable. But this act of defiance only enraged Titus further. Titus would build miles of walls around Jerusalem, sealing the city entirely as no more outside aid could come to the city. Hope vanished, food disappeared, and morale broke. Instead of mounting further defenses, Bar-Gior turned on the Jews themselves, specifically Jerusalem's elite, executing nobles and priests en masse. Ironically, John himself plundered the temple treasury, the very act that had sparked the revolt years earlier under Eleazar ben Hananiah and Gessius Florus. But such barbaric treatment was normal by this point, as the iron grip of Simon Bar-Gior and John of Gischala grew stronger. And when Antonia fortress fell, the misery of the Jewish situation revealed itself. Titus would now set his eyes upon the Jewish temple itself, the seat of Jewish identity. And after a mere 12 hours of fighting, Roman forces breached the temple. Fires spread. Women and children who had fled to the sanctuary perished. Hundreds killed themselves out of misery. Seeing the very temple that was the center of their worship for centuries burnt to the ground. The Romans looted and razed the Temple Mount, ending Jewish sacrificial worship and destroying the heart of Jerusalem. Having no other choice, their power being crippled, Bar-Gior and John begged Titus for mercy, but it was too late. Jerusalem was already in ruins. Only 3 towers would remain, as the entire city of Jerusalem would be destroyed. Josephus mourned the devastation. Places which were adorned with trees and pleasant gardens have now become desolate. The lush streets of Jerusalem were gone, the city reduced to ashes. For those who lived through it, survival came at the cost of witnessing the utter erasure of their world. All remaining resistance was crushed. John surrendered. Bar-Gior tried to hide beneath the ruined temple, but was captured. When he emerged, the city he had once ruled was unrecognizable. Dragged before Titus by Roman soldiers, he was condemned and executed, thrown to his death in Greece as a final spectacle of Rome's vengeance. The Jewish revolt, once seen by its leaders as a righteous stand for independence, ended in ruin. Titus's triumph in Rome would be eternalized, but for the Jews, it marked the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the spiritual and political center of the world, lost to fire, famine, and the fury of empire. The fall of Jerusalem marked the end of any hope of Jewish victory. One by one would the final centers of Jewish resistance be quashed: Herodium, Macarius, and finally the fortress of Masada. Masada would not fall with a Roman assault, but with a tragic final stand. Rather than humiliate themselves by surrendering to Rome, the entire Jewish garrison would commit suicide. These were the Sicarii, the final remnants of Jewish zealot resistance. And with the final Sicarii soldier's death, the Jewish revolt died with them. The Jewish defeats by Rome in the 3 Jewish-Roman wars of 66 to 70, 115 to 17, and 132 to 35 CE were massive and virtually unprecedented, certainly in the internal history of the Roman Empire. There was no return from exile and no rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. While the Roman oppression faced by the Jews would never end, and the Jewish revolt was not the final one, it would be unmatched by its utter cruelty and impact on Jewish society. The revolt should have gone differently, but leader incompetence, despotism, and greed ruined it. Thanks to the actions of all leaders, from Eleazar ben Hananiah to Simon Bar-Giora, Never again would Jewish society be as organized as it was under Second Temple Judaism, as the Essenes, Sadducees, and Zealots all vanished immediately afterwards. Rome continued in its national heritage of erasing cultures, and this time it would be conducted against the Jews. Even the Pharisees would never be the same in their power, as the Romans reduced the authority of the Jewish Sanhedrin, and the Jews increasingly fled Judea across Europe to escape Roman persecution. All that remained were the rabbis and their religious guidance and nostalgia. This nostalgia brings us to today. The memory of having a homeland lived on in the Jewish minds for millennia, and as ethnic and identities were reforged during the 18th and 19th centuries, so too did Jewish identity. If you liked this series, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if this video does well, I might make a follow-up on exploring the history of Zionism. Thank you for watching.